In the article Sexual Perversion by Thomas Nagel, the author goes to great lengths to define the concepts of sexual desire and sexual perversion in order to identify exactly what about human sexuality qualifies it to admit of perversions. Before examining exactly what constitutes as a sexual perversion, the author first makes sure to dispute the claim that sexual perversion is a non-existent abstraction. He references the common argument that denies the existence of any such thing as a sexual perversion. The basis for this argument is the claim that sexual desire is simply one of the many appetites such as hunger or thirst. As such, it may have various objects, some more common than others. Although we may fail to empathize with many of these desires, this does not mean that they are perverted. Sexuality, it is said, does not admit of imperfection or perversion. Nagel refutes this claim essentially using the basis of this skeptical argument to undermine its validity. He compares the sexual appetite to that of the appetite of hunger. He talks of the reality of gastronomical perversion, and says that even an appetite can have perversions if, in addition to its biological function, it has significant psychological structure. To provide the foundation for what comes to be his main argument throughout the piece, Nagel turns to reference the works of Sartre. In his work, Sartre does not actually touch on the issue of sexual perversion itself. This is mainly due to the way he views sexual desire. Sexual desire, he says, is merely one form of the perpetual attempt of an embodied consciousness to incorporate another into his world as another subject, an attempt that is said to fail. Essentially, Sartre claims that by partaking in a sexual relation, the ability to maintain both persons' subjectivity is lost. One or the other is either entirely reduced to that of the object. In this case, he says the aim of sexual desire can never be accomplished. As Nagel points out, Sartre's argument entails a few weaknesses. His view of the sexual relation rendering impossible prevents the basic distinction between complete and incomplete sex, therefore unable to admit the concept of perversion. Though he ignores the main premise of Nagel's focus, his talk of the attempt to possess that of which is the object of sexual desire carried out by a double reciprocal incarnation ultimately provides Nagel with the foundation for the central argument that he poses in this piece. As Nagel expresses, sexual desire is a psychological process that involves a mutual perception. These perceptions include not only the perceptions of the sexual object, perceptions of oneself as well. Sexual awareness of another ultimately involves substantial awareness of oneself, much greater than what is ordinarily involved in perception. To provide clarity about such mutual perceptions, the author presents the situation with one example of Romeo and Juliet. Basically, it is said that mutual perceptions are brought about by first the acknowledgement and sensing of the other, whom is the object of sexual desire, in this case from Romeo to Juliet. At this instance, Romeo is in the sexual grip of his body, being aroused by an unaroused object, Juliet. The next step is for Juliet to notice Romeo. As she does, Romeo soon begins to pick up on her obvious signs of sexual arousal, not only noticing but sensing these as well. His eventual sense of Juliet sensing him ultimately brings about an entirely new crucial aspect to this development. Romeo is granted a sense of embodiment not only through his own reactions but through the eyes and reactions of another. The last step here is the acknowledgement and sensing by Juliet of Romeo. This ultimately puts Romeo in the position to be aroused by her arousal being sensed by him. The reflective levels of perception, as he senses that she senses that he senses her, make one conscious of his sexuality through his awareness of its effect on her and vice versa. Every sexual act is in essence said to be psychological because it relies on the participants' conceptions of themselves and each other which become embodied in the act. Therefore, sexual desire is not merely the perception of the embodiment of another, it is actually a contribution to his further embodiment, enhancing the subject's original perception of himself. Essentially, what Nagel defines as a sexual perversion is that of various deviations that do not complete the configuration of the mutual reflexive perception that he discusses. Narcissistic practices, bestiality, intercourse with infants, and inanimate objects are all said to be perversions stuck in the first stage. If the object of one's sexual desire is not alive, it is incapable of reciprocating this desire, therefore rendering the experience of an awareness of one's own sexual embodiment alone. Children and animals, although very much alive, are also incapable of reciprocity in the sense that they do not recognize themselves as the object of the subject desire. Nagel goes into further detail when discussing the perversions of sadism and masochism, both of which have to do with a malfunction in the second stage, involving the awareness of oneself as the object of another's sexual desire. The sadist focuses on the evocation of passive self-awareness in others, seeking to inflict pain and control upon the object of his desire. In the attempt to dominate his or her partner, the sadist becomes completely engulfed in his role as the agent. His ability to recognize himself as the object of another is non-existent as he clings to his agency. A masochist, on the other hand, enjoys pain being inflicted upon him. Due to the inability to acknowledge himself as the object of one's sexual desires, the masochist sees himself as merely the object of another's control. He imposes the perversion that the sadist embodies on his partner, on himself, letting go of his own agency. Both of these disorders are in the eyes of Nagel perversions because they defy the model that he presents, rendering it incomplete. They lack the completion of the instinctual reflexivity of perceptions that are triggered by sexual desire and ultimately result in a successful sexual relation. I believe that Nagel in this piece poses a rather strong argument. By providing an in-depth explanation of just what it means to encompass sexual desire and the necessary mutual perceptions that allow for the ideal sexual relation, Nagel is able to exquisitely justify his claims about what constitutes as a sexual perversion and ultimately provide a deeper look into the very compulsions that we endure as embodied consciousness.